He was once a billionaire CEO, unstoppable, untouchable, until the empire he built began to crumble beneath him. Facing bankruptcy, scandals, and the weight of his past, he stumbles back into the life of the woman he abandoned without a word, not knowing she had been carrying his triplets. Years later, she's stronger, wiser, and when their paths cross again, nothing prepares him for the moment he sees the three little faces that look just like his. But is it too late for redemption? Or is this broken man about to discover the true meaning of family? Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video, because when you stop doing this, YouTube understands that you don't like this content and stops recommending good stories like this. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Of course, here is the revised and expanded version of Chapter 1, adhering to the specified character count and all guidelines. Chapter 1, The Silent Humiliation. Luna Mendez, the daughter of a housemaid, grew up in the back quarters of a luxury mansion in one of the city's richest neighborhoods. Her world, for as long as she could remember, was the narrow hallway that led to the servant quarters at the back of the Whitmore estate. While other children played in parks, Luna learned how to fold linens and polish crystal under her mother's watchful eye. Her mother, Clarice, had worked for the Whitmores since she was barely older than Luna was now, and she carried a quiet discipline that Luna admired. From a young age, Luna understood that while she was in the house, she was not of it. The Whitmores' world shimmered just beyond her reach, a place of grand piano music, distant laughter, and the scent of imported roses she was never to touch. She moved like a shadow, present, necessary, but invisible. Clarice always reminded her, "We work here, that's all. You don't look at what doesn't belong to you." And Luna never did, until the line between what belonged to her and what didn't began to blur. At 19, she landed her first real job as an administrative assistant at the company owned by the man who lived in the mansion, Whitmore and Sons Enterprises. She had earned the position on merit, with a sharp mind, straight A's, and glowing letters of recommendation. Her mother hadn't been thrilled, having seen too much over the years, to believe the walls of that family could ever accept one of them as anything other than invisible. But Luna had insisted, "I'm not going there to be accepted. I'm going there to build a future." Determined to be competent, efficient, and forgettable, her plan worked for a while. Then one morning, the heir, Arthur Whitmore, fell for her. He stepped into the administrative bullpen, his eyes scanning the room, and his gaze paused on Luna a beat too long. That was the beginning. Arthur possessed the kind of charm that felt manufactured, and his presence commanded rooms. He began stopping by her desk, sometimes to ask a meaningless question, sometimes just to nod. The attention was unsettling at first, but it soon escalated. Then came the late emails, the requests to stay after hours for urgent filing, and the occasional brush of his hand over hers. It was never overt, but never innocent. The office whispered, with one secretary warning her, "He's not cruel, he's careless, and that's worse." Their romance was a tightly kept secret. Arthur was never seen with her in public, never held her hand outside the confines of a dim hallway or the smoked glass of his office door. But in private, he spoke to her about her dreams and her childhood, making her feel seen not just as a pretty face or the daughter of staff, but as a woman with depth. She lived for months in the illusion of equality, confusing access with affection. She didn't dare ask what their relationship was, afraid that naming it would end it. She didn't notice that while she was falling, Arthur remained exactly where he always was, untouched, unchanged, unavailable. The ground rushed up when Luna missed her period. A pregnancy test blinked 2 pink lines within seconds, and her stomach dropped. She chose a quiet evening in his dim, jazz-filled apartment to tell Arthur. She expected tension, but not the cold, absolute shift that followed. He didn't shout or flinch. He simply stared at her for a long time, then reached for his glass of whiskey. "Luna," he said calmly, "you know, this isn't real life." He sighed. You knew what this was. This was never going to be something we could carry forward. He finished his drink. I'm saying you should take care of it quietly. The room didn't spin. It shattered. Luna left without another word. 2 days after telling him, Luna and her mother were fired without a word. The whispers at the office had turned into stares, and Arthur no longer acknowledged her. Finally, HR called her in for a brief performance review, telling her that her contract would not be renewed because they were restructuring. Clarice was let go 3 days later. There was no explanation, just a terse phone call from the house manager. Your services are no longer required. Please vacate by 8:01 a.m. Wednesday. Kicked out, ignored, forgotten, the message was clear. As they packed their 2 modest suitcases, Clarice said, We'll leave with dignity. Let them keep the lies. We take the truth. Standing on the marble steps, they left not in defeat, but in a fury so quiet it burned. Carefully protected within an envelope in her purse was a crisp black and white ultrasound photo. A stunned doctor had informed her that 3 tiny sacs were visible. It's rare but not impossible, he'd said. Triplets. Luna hadn't told her mother, and she certainly hadn't told Arthur. It was a fact she decided to hide from everyone, a secret she would carry forward alone. Luna and her mother, Clarice, moved into a modest 2-room apartment on the south side of the city, a place far from the polished sidewalks and luxury boutiques Luna had once walked past daily. The building smelled faintly of detergent and old pipes, but it was clean. The walls were beige, the furniture borrowed from neighbors who had little but offered it generously. As if preparing for a guest, Clarice immediately began arranging the kitchen, wiping down the stove and organizing the pantry with methodical hands. Luna sat on the edge of a narrow bed, feeling the weight of gravity differently now. That night, as they sipped soup from mismatched bowls, Clarice finally broke the silence that had settled between them. You're not just leaving something behind, she said, her voice steady. You're carrying something forward. Don't confuse the two. Luna nodded, blinking back tears, the ultrasound photo still hidden in her purse. What she felt wasn't heartbreak anymore. It was something quieter, heavier, and much colder. It was the moment before grief, when the air itself felt like it couldn't be trusted. Over the next few weeks, Luna tried to disappear into the routine of survival. She found work as a temp secretary at a neighborhood law office, paid by the hour, never guaranteed more than 3 shifts at a time. Her body began to change, first subtly, then unmistakably. Nausea arrived like clockwork, stealing her mornings, and fatigue became a constant companion. She said nothing to her employer, terrified that any sign of vulnerability would mean another dismissal. Her mother took on a job cleaning offices at night, her hands swelling from long hours and chemical exposure. They barely saw each other except in passing, a shared glance over dinner. Their bond held together not by choice, but by a shared wound they refused to let define them. Luna began journaling late at night, scribbling fragments of thoughts she couldn't voice aloud. I feel like I'm disappearing, she wrote, like I'm both the vessel and the void. The pain hadn't lessened, but it had hardened into something usable. It was no longer about Arthur. It was about who she would have to become for them. By night, she worked by the window light in their rented room, repairing clothes or hemming dresses for women in the neighborhood. Word of her skill spread slowly, with clients bringing bags of worn fabric. Luna never overcharged. She worked in silence, her hands steady even when her body cried for rest. This new focus became her armor. She dedicated herself to research, using borrowed library books to learn about prenatal nutrition and triplet pregnancies. She started keeping a logbook, tracking every expense and every cent saved, with no margin for error. She sketched out a meticulous 6-month plan in a notebook she carried everywhere, as if the mere act of planning could keep chaos at bay. The ultrasound printouts were now pinned inside her closet door, hidden where no one could see them. She stood there often, one hand on her stomach, the other curled into a fist. She knew that if Arthur had erased her with so little effort, he would only try to control or deny the 3 lives involved. She vowed not to tell him. maybe not ever. In her head, she gave them nicknames. The left one, who always curled tight, the right one stretching like a dancer, and the one in the middle, who seemed to float calmly between the others. They were a promise of consequence, a reason not to fall apart. One morning, Luna stood in front of the mirror and saw someone new. Her face was fuller and her eyes were ringed with fatigue, but there was something steady there too. She no longer looked like the girl who had hoped Arthur would choose her. That girl had been left on the floor of his penthouse next to an empty whiskey glass. She rubbed a thumb over the swelling curve of her lower abdomen and breathed deeply. "You will not be small," she whispered to herself, "not in the ways that matter." She had grown up being treated like a shadow, a burden. She made a vow. Her children would not inherit that invisibility, not if she could help it. While Luna fought for survival, Arthur Whitmore continued his life of luxury and excess, having been raised on marble floors and taught that his name alone could open doors others didn't even know existed. In the early months after Luna's departure, he barely thought of her. In his mind, she was just another youthful indulgence, a complication that had been resolved. His attention turned to more serious ventures, new tech investments, bold mergers, and offshore acquisitions. He was praised in magazines for his modern risk appetite, though many in his circle whispered that Arthur was gambling recklessly. But Arthur didn't hear the murmurs. He was too busy chasing the next big win, hosting galas, and delivering keynote speeches about vision and legacy. He wasn't running a company anymore. He was performing an empire. In that performance, he began to ignore the fine print, overlook unstable partners, and dismiss the cautious voices on his board. He was a Whitmore, after all. His empire couldn't fall until it did. The unraveling began subtly, like a small crack in glass. A partner in Singapore pulled out of a joint venture at the last minute. A major client filed a quiet complaint about misrepresentation in their contract. An audit revealed inconsistencies that Arthur waved away as clerical errors, but the numbers didn't lie. The company's liquidity was draining faster than its revenue could replenish it. His CFO warned him directly, "We need to slow down, cut expansion, stabilize." Arthur waved a hand dismissively. "Fear doesn't build empires," he replied. He approved another acquisition 2 days later. Behind the glossy press release, the financials were dire. Creditors began circling, and banks started tightening their terms. Staff layoffs were initiated in quiet waves, not enough to cause public alarm, but just enough to keep the lights on. Arthur started hosting fewer events, and the private jet remained grounded. Art from the Whitmore estate began disappearing from the walls. "Just redecorating," he told a guest, though the staff knew an antique vase had been sold for $40,000 at a private auction. The cufflinks he wore to his father's funeral were next. But still, he smiled and insisted, "Everything is fine." The media began to sniff around. First, a niche financial blog posted an anonymous tip about inconsistencies in overseas filings. Then a more reputable outlet published a headline that caught fire: "Is the Whitmore empire cracking?" Arthur furiously ordered his PR team to shut it down, but there was little they could do. Rumors became headlines, and headlines sparked investigations. A former senior analyst gave an off-the-record quote that was too sharp to ignore. "Arthur bets with legacy money and calls it genius. If he were anyone else, we'd call it what it is: reckless." Board members who once toasted his boldness now held secret meetings to distance themselves. Arthur refused to attend. He began to wake with a pit in his stomach, stopped sleeping, and began drinking earlier each day. The image mattered more than ever. He couldn't afford to look like he was losing. The Whitmore estate, once a symbol of generational strength, now felt like a museum of fading confidence. He walked the quiet halls at night, scotch in hand, judged by the portraits of his ancestors. His father's words, "The name must be bigger than the man," now echoed like a curse. His mother, having moved to the south of France, refused his calls. "I warned you not to mistake charm for strategy," she wrote in a single-sentence email. His closest allies began to flinch when his name was mentioned. In a desperate attempt to reclaim control, Arthur hosted a private investor summit at the estate, a lavish affair designed to distract from the panic. "We are not declining. We are evolving," he told the crowd, a smile barely reaching his eyes. The applause was thin. In the following days, the investors he had tried to court withdrew quietly, one by one. He stopped checking the company's share value. The numbers made him nauseous. He watched the lights dim in rooms that once overflowed with laughter. He still couldn't say the word failure. He whispered to no one in the empty dining hall, "How did it get this far?" There was no answer. His world was crumbling, not with noise or fire, but with the silence of abandonment, like stone eroding under a whisper. The first garment Luna ever sold wasn't meant for profit. It was a soft, hand-stitched onesie made from repurposed cotton sheets, embroidered with a tiny moon and 3 stars. Her neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, admired it and asked if she could buy one for her niece. That simple request sparked a possibility. That night, Luna stayed up tracing patterns on brown paper and sketching designs on the back of grocery receipts. She had no formal training in fashion, but what she did have was instinct, patience, and a mother's eye for function and softness. Within a week, she had sewn 3 more outfits and sold them all by word of mouth. She reinvested every cent into more fabric, remnants and discounted bolts from the market. Her hands, already used to the rhythm of survival, now stitched with a new kind of purpose, not just to clothe her children, but to clothe a future. By the 3rd month, Luna had quietly built a steady list of clients from the neighborhood. Women came with folded bills in their palms, hoping to find something gentle and made with intention for their newborns. Luna's living room had transformed into a miniature atelier. Her mother's ironing board doubled as a cutting station, and a fold-out table was cluttered with fabric scissors, chalk, and buttons stored in glass jars. She didn't have a logo, but she signed each piece with a tiny stitched crescent moon hidden near the hem. The orders began to stretch beyond her neighborhood as friends of friends called. One woman from across the city offered to pay double for a custom layette, but Luna declined the extra money, believing in fairness, not charity. At night, once the triplets were asleep, their synchronized breathing the soundtrack of her ambition, Luna taught herself the basics of online marketing. Using free YouTube tutorials and downloadable PDFs, she learned how to photograph her products against clean backgrounds with natural light. Her smartphone became her education portal, her accounting system, and her storefront all at once. Despite the endless stitching and late-night budgeting, Luna felt herself growing into the work and the identity it gave her. She no longer walked with the posture of someone who had been reduced. There was pride in the way she handed a mother a finished set of newborn clothes, wrapped in parchment and tied with twine. Customers noticed. One woman cried, saying, "No one's ever made something so thoughtful for my baby." When she finally registered her business legally, with trembling fingers and teary eyes, she named it Thread and Root. The name symbolized everything she had learned, the thread that held her life together, and the roots she was planting for something that would last. In the quiet corners of her community, Luna was no longer invisible. She was indispensable. Her triplets, Mateo, Elias, and Nova, were growing into distinct little souls. Mateo was curious and always asking questions. Elias was physical, always climbing furniture or building towers with fabric rolls. Nova was quiet but intensely observant, once mimicking the exact way Luna held a thread between her fingers. They were inseparable, moving like a single organism with 3 hearts. There were no mentions of Arthur in the house. His name never passed their lips. He was an absence, not a mystery, and they never asked. They didn't know they were born of abandonment. They only knew they were chosen. Clarice watched her daughter with quiet reverence, now helping by folding fabric and minding the children. "I used to think we had to stay small to stay safe," she told Luna one night. "But you're making space for something bigger." Luna looked up from her sewing machine, her eyes tired but glowing. "I'm not making space," she said softly. "I'm building it." By the end of the year, Thread and Root had its own website, and orders were arriving from out of state. Luna was no longer just surviving. She was claiming freedom, ownership, and presence, not through declarations, but through quiet, consistent, beautiful work. This work provided not just sustenance, but gave her a new identity and a profound sense of pride. 6 years after she walked out of the iron gates with 2 suitcases and a folded ultrasound, the listing appeared almost quietly, as if the universe had grown shy about poetic symmetry. Luna stumbled across it by accident, or so she told herself. She had been reviewing a client order when the real estate ad popped up in the sidebar. Historic Whitmore Estate, judicial auction, price on request. She stared at the screen for a long moment, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. She hadn't thought about the house in years, not directly, but it had lived in her. It was there in the way she checked locks twice, in the way her chest tightened at the smell of jasmine, in the way she refused to walk beneath chandeliers. And now, it was being auctioned. The listing called it an opportunity for visionaries. She read it twice, then once more, before closing the laptop and brewing tea. That night, as the triplets colored pictures on the floor and Clarice sorted inventory in the next room, Luna stared at the blank wall across from her and whispered aloud for the first time, "What if it was mine?" The decision that followed came not from impulse, but from cold calculation. Luna spent weeks researching property law, zoning requirements, historical restoration grants, and bidding procedures. She ran the numbers twice, then a third time, building spreadsheets as thorough as any CFO's. She wasn't dazzled by nostalgia or blinded by symbolic revenge. This was about practicality, about legacy, about writing a future in the space where her past had once tried to erase her. Thread and Root had become profitable enough to sustain the offer, not ostentatiously, but steadily. She consulted her accountant, a meticulous woman who wore thick glasses and never smiled. "It's a bold move," the woman said after reviewing the proposal. "Risky." Luna nodded. So was having 3 kids with nothing but a sewing machine. The woman blinked, then nodded once. The bid was submitted under Luna's business name, shielded by legal proxies and shell partners. She wanted no headlines, no pity, no applause. If she won, she wanted it to be because she had offered the most value, not because she had the most dramatic story. The day of the auction arrived without fanfare. Luna didn't attend. She stayed home, making soup for the kids, her phone on, silent. The call came at 3:42 p.m. Her offer had been accepted. She returned to the mansion, not with a crowd, but with a locksmith. There were no reporters, no champagne, no social media declarations. It was just Luna, the triplets, and Clarice standing at the base of the same steps they had descended in silence 6 years before. The locksmith struggled with the antique lock, muttering about rust and bad design. The children, unaware of the weight the air carried, ran up and down the steps laughing. Clarice stood quietly, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Watching her sons chase their sister across the circular driveway, Luna said, "It feels smaller than I remember." Her mother nodded. "You were smaller when you left." The door finally creaked open, and dust rolled out in waves, sunlight catching in the air like floating ash. The house was empty, stripped of furniture and warmth, but the bones remained. The staircase curved like a spine. The fireplace loomed like an open mouth. Luna stepped in without hesitation. She didn't flinch when the floorboards groaned beneath her feet. She moved room by room, slowly, like someone reacquainting themselves with an old enemy who had grown soft with time. She didn't cry or smile. She simply walked. The war was over. She had returned not as a survivor, but as the new architect. The first thing she did was remove the brass nameplate at the gate. Whitmore, polished, smug, imperial, came off with a screwdriver and a firm grip. She placed it inside a cloth bag without ceremony. There would be no commemorative bonfire, no Instagram post of her crushing it beneath her heel. She had nothing to prove. The new plate was simpler, etched in matte silver. Thread and root family center. The name fit the structure in a way Whitmore never had. This wouldn't be a house of secrets or status anymore. It would be a house of creation. Luna planned every detail meticulously. The first floor would house a small workshop for community sewing programs. The east wing would serve as a rotating nursery space for single mothers who needed short-term childcare. The old ballroom, with its 30-foot ceilings and crumbling chandeliers, would become a learning center with free Wi-Fi, free coffee, and free knowledge. There would be no tours or press junkets, just work. She hired local contractors, artists, and electricians, people who had once been on the outside of doors like these. This place was built to exclude, she told one worker. We're going to rebuild it to welcome. The mansion, once a space of secrets and status, was beginning its reconstruction as a place of sanctuary and creation. Arthur Whitmore had not planned to be a driver, not when he cut ceremonial ribbons in boardrooms or when his name once commanded buildings to tremble. But pride, like capital, had long since run dry. The fall hadn't been a cinematic collapse. It was a slow, humiliating erosion of relevance. After the final investors pulled out and the company dissolved in legal knots too costly to untangle, he'd sold his last shares for a whisper of their former worth. The estate was gone, along with the cars, the tailored suits, and the assistants who once hovered like satellites. What remained was a tarnished last name and a rented studio apartment that smelled of old plaster. He drove because it paid for groceries and gas, sometimes enough to keep the electricity on. Most days, he kept his cap low and his eyes forward. No one recognized him anymore, not without the polished armor of wealth. One night, a premium fare came through, a ride that twisted through the wealthier parts of the city. Neighborhoods he used to belong to, places he now passed like a tourist. The closer he got, the more familiar the streets became, a familiarity that settled not in his memory, but in his muscle tension. As his car climbed the gentle slope into Whitmore Park, his fingers curled slightly against the steering wheel. He hadn't allowed himself near this part of the city in years. There were too many ghosts. The GPS pinged. He turned onto the circular drive of a grand estate and froze. The iron gates were unmistakable, even without the Whitmore plaque. The architecture hadn't changed, but something deeper had. The mansion looked alive, not staged or curated, but truly alive. The front garden was blooming with an unruly joy it was never permitted under his mother's watch. Wild lavender, sunflowers, and marigolds grew with abandon. And then he saw her. In the middle of the garden, wearing a deep green dress, stood Luna. She was laughing, her head tilted back, a hose in her hand as water sprayed gently over the flower beds. Around her, 3 children danced barefoot on the grass. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. The world narrowed to that single scene. The woman, the children, the house. It wasn't rage that filled him, nor jealousy. It was something worse. It was recognition. These were the lives he'd turned away from, now standing whole before him. The children bore his eyes, his chin. The one on the right, a boy with a shock of dark curls, laughed the way Arthur once had at that age. The girl, she had Luna's mouth, but Arthur's intensity in her gaze. They were running toward her, shrieking with delight. The sound of a door opening behind him broke the trance. "We've arrived," his passenger said. Arthur's mouth opened, but no words came. He stared at Luna, the life that was once a complication, now the very definition of stability. "No," he said at last, his voice thin. "Just drive." He couldn't look back. In the months that followed, he tried to make contact. He sat at the chipped kitchen table in his rental, the pen hovering over blank paper. He wrote several versions of a letter, filled with lofty explanations or attempted humility, but all of them ended up in the trash. He couldn't find the right voice because the one that simply said, "I failed you," was one he had never learned to speak. Every attempt sounded like excuses dressed as honesty. He didn't want pity and knew he didn't deserve forgiveness, but a small part of him needed her to know that he saw it all now. Phone calls weren't easier. He found her number through public business records for the Thread and Root Family Center. The first time he called, it rang twice and disconnected. The second time, a child's voice answered, "Mommy's busy right now." Then silence. When he tried again, weeks later, it went straight to voicemail. His messages were short, too cautious. "Hi, it's Arthur. I just wanted to ask how you're doing. I thought maybe we could talk. No expectations." After the third attempt, he stopped leaving messages altogether. Each missed call became a reflection of the silence he'd once used like a weapon, now cutting in reverse. It cut not because she refused to respond, but because she no longer needed to. He finally understood the difference. Forgiveness would require something from Luna, but being seen was his burden to carry. His sentence was to know that she understood exactly what he had been and what he had chosen not to be. He understood now that some truths are meant to be carried, not spoken. His fate was not to be forgiven, but to live quietly in the space that forgiveness never reached, while the life he had abandoned bloomed just beyond his reach. Você tem toda a razão. Peço desculpas pela minha falha contínua em atender a contagem de caracteres solicitada. Meus esforços para expandir o texto foram insuficientes e não respeitaram a escala do que você pediu. Foi um erro da minha parte e agradeço sua persistência. Vou reescrever o capítulo 7 mais uma vez, desta vez com uma abordagem muito mais detalhada para garantir que ele atinja a meta de 8.000 caracteres, ao mesmo tempo que sigo rigorosamente todas as outras diretrizes. Chapter 7. The Closing of the Circle. The call came on a Wednesday morning, the kind that arrives quietly but alters the air. Luna was folding laundry when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She answered with her usual calm, not out of expectation, but as a practiced reflex. A man's voice on the other end, clinical as if reading from a script, asked for her by name. "We're reaching out regarding Arthur Whitmore," he began. "There's been an incident." Luna stood still, a cotton shirt half folded in her hands as the man continued. He informed her that Arthur had suffered a massive stroke and had passed away at Mercy General 2 days prior. There was no next of kin listed, he explained, and her name had come up in some archived files. The man paused, the kind of pause that fished for a reaction, but Luna gave none. She cut into the silence, her voice even and unshakable. "Thank you for letting me know." She ended the call gently and returned to folding the shirt. Across the room, Clarice looked up but said nothing. She had heard enough to understand. Luna didn't speak of Arthur, not then, not in the hours that followed. She simply moved through the house, her actions steady, washing dishes, reviewing inventory, answering emails. But later that night, she quietly removed the children's formal clothes from the back of the closet and began ironing. The funeral was held at a modest chapel on the city's edge, the kind where worn pews creaked with history and dust lingered in the high beams. There were no reporters, no extended Whitmore family, no public condolences. Arthur had outlived his legacy, but not his isolation. The service was brief, with a young priest reading a standard passage, his eyes drifting across the rows of mostly empty seats. A former business partner came, offering a tight nod before disappearing down the hall. A former housekeeper sat at the back, dabbing her eyes with a cloth. And then there was Luna, seated in the middle pew, flanked by her 3 children, all dressed in navy and charcoal. She did not wear black. Her dress was dark green, soft and unassuming, a quiet mirror of the woman she had become. Her children sat tall beside her, hands folded, their eyes alert. They had never met Arthur, but they knew the shape of his absence. Luna had never poisoned them with bitterness. She had simply left space for their own conclusions, and now they were here, not to mourn, but to close a page. When the casket was lowered, Luna did not echo the final prayer. She simply looked down at the engraved name, Arthur Whitmore, and let the silence rise, the same silence he had offered her so long ago when he answered her pregnancy, her eviction, her letters never returned. She had lived in its echo, built against it, and now she returned it, not out of vengeance, but symmetry. Each child stepped forward, approaching the grave with a grace that startled even the groundskeepers. They laid their flowers down with care, Mateo, a white rose, Elias, a marigold, Nova, a daisy. As they reached the car, Nova looked up at her mother and asked, "Was he someone important to us?" Luna looked at her for a long moment and replied, "Once, but not anymore." With his death, the last echo of the past dissipated. The story's final chapter began with the official opening of the Rays Foundation, Luna's final, most meaningful endeavor, housed within the very structure that was once a monument to exclusion. The front room, once a parlor of velvet drapes and careful conversations, now had sunlight streaming through wide glass windows where Luna had replaced the heavy curtains with linen. Soft wooden floors stretched beneath desks, hand-built by a local carpenter, and walls once hung with portraits of Whitmores now displayed framed sketches from neighborhood children and quotes in stitched fabric. The foundation's mission was simple: to equip single mothers with tools to create their own futures through business literacy workshops, microloans, and shared childcare. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no press, just quiet action. This wasn't for applause, it was for impact. Clarice had refused to call herself retired. "I've simply evolved," she'd say, and now taught budgeting classes on weekends. "Your worth is not your balance sheet," she told the mothers who came through the door, "but knowing how to manage both, that's power." Luna, now a figure of quiet inspiration, declined interviews. "You're an icon," one journalist wrote, but Luna was not interested in becoming an icon. Icons are worshipped and forgotten. She was interested in being useful, in teaching sustainability, in reminding women that survival is not the finish line, it's the first stitch. One evening, as they ate at a long table hand-carved by a woman in the program, Nova asked the question that hung in the history of the house. "Did you build all this to prove something to him?" Luna looked up, her fork resting against her plate, and smiled with a clarity that held no pity. "No," she said, "I didn't win to show him I could. I won so you three would never wonder if you were enough. I built this to remind you who you are." And in the peaceful stillness that followed, it was clear they knew. They bore no hatred, only roots, thick, deep, and interwoven, planted by a woman who had taught them their value was never in doubt. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.